Well, hello everybody. We'd like to welcome you to this BERA History SIG annual event. This year, obviously, we are having to meet online, but I personally am just really pleased that we're able to meet at all, because last year we weren't able to have an event. So it's really nice to see everyone virtually, or at least to see people's names. And I hope we're going to have a really good event today. Just before we introduce the speakers and the topic, I'm just going to hand over briefly to my fellow SIG convener, Debbie Sabrich, just to talk a little bit about the SIG and what we've been doing over the last year.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon to everybody out there. My job is to explain a little bit about the History SIG. The History SIG in BERA is what I would consider to be a broad church. So this is not going to focus solely on historians of education, although there are a number of historians of education who are joining us today. We also include those who are involved in the training of history educators, so those involved in teacher training, PGCEs, skits, etc. And we also involve history teachers who are interested in our topics, but we're also willing to involve anybody who wishes to engage with the topic at hand. So we welcome you. We hope that you enjoy today's events, and we hope that you have great questions for each of our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. And just to say a little bit about the event, what we really wanted to do with this event today was to bring together, as Debbie was saying, historians of education working with sensory history approaches and history educators who may work with sensory pedagogies in their own teaching practice. One of the key questions that we want to ask is, in what ways does a focus on sensory experiences allow us to access the lived experience of education? Whether that be on the part of students, parents, teachers, and wider communities. Those are some of the questions that I'm thinking about in my own research at the moment. So I'd be really interested to hear what the speakers have to say about that. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Geert Thijssen, who is Associate Professor in Educational Sciences at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. His research is focused mainly on social and cultural history of education, but also he has worked on visual and material culture and sensory studies. And his current work focuses on senses of belonging in relation to food and street art. And today, Geert is going to talk about sensuous childhoods, outdoor education, and the sensed world of learning, a centered interdisciplinary perspective. Thank you, Geert.
Thank you so much, Heather. I hope everyone can hear me well as well. Okay, thank you so much for introducing me and for inviting me to this lovely event. This is roughly the structure of the talk I'll be having today, and I hope to rush through that just in time, which is going to be quite tricky, so that I'll zoom in on the problem statement and highlight what my research question and methodology and theory have been, and then I'll go into the main body to have a look at different ways in which smell actually, or sense related to smell might matter. In a recent article called Sense and Sensibility, Karen Cerullo suggests that we make sense of and attribute meanings to smells in ways that both emerge from and recreate the organization of social life, and wonders, but exactly how does that process unfold? In her paper, Cerullo draws on social cultural theories to understand how, in her terms, we decipher information, or smell in this case, encountered. Learning is only referred to explicitly as a process she herself engaged in while conducting research, and education in turn as a level obtained by her participants. These are threads I pick up in this talk to explore formal and informal sensory learning in entangled contexts of health and outdoor education. In my talk, I use as examples a Belgian open-air school founded in 1904 by an assistance fund of a teacher association in Antwerp called Diesterbeek, and those created in 1913 and 1928 in Luxembourg with support from the industrialist family called Mayrisch and its networks through the steel concern Arbeid, now known as ArcelorMittal, to analyze the worlds of sense and other sense to which they belonged and potentially still belong. Now, much has been written from a socio-historical perspective about smell and the senses generally, following the work of Lucien Febvre, Walter Ong, and Alain Corbin, among others. Work by the Concordia Sensoria research team, in turn, has been key to stressing the cultural dimensions of smell as a historical phenomenon. Yet while the exploration of scent, as some have argued, is in a real sense an investigation into the essence of human culture, at least in the modern West, smell has needed to be sniffed out of the scholarly and cultural unconscious into the open air of intellectual discourse. Associations of smell with the body, emotion, primitive instincts, animality, etc. have been held responsible for this. The cultural turn to the study of smell since the 1990s has rehabilitated smell, not just as a way of sensing the world, but just as importantly as a way of making sense of the world. At the same time, the notion of a monolithic Western hegemony of vision has been nuanced. And the Western five senses model itself, with its hierarchical repartition, going back as far as Aristotle, has furthermore been reassessed as an historical confluence different from certain non-Western sensory models. More recently, the idea of cultural inscription of the senses has been complicated. And while overall more dynamic relational understandings have congealed around culture and nature, body and mind, etc., conflicting views of sensory ways of sense-making are still held. There are those, for instance, David Howes, who have pointed to multiple respects in which culture mediates sensation and sensation mediates culture, with cultures being conceived of as embodying different ways of sensing. Others, for instance, Tim Ingold, argue against the idea that in order to make sense of the world, induced sensations are cognitively constructed in terms of received cultural categories, and hold that senses are not keyboards or filters that mediate the traffic between mind and body and world, but rather aspects of the functioning of a living being. Debates have worked to overstate the differences between both positions, I think, which share an interest in sentient beings as bundles of interconnected experiences and properties whose various modes of being in the world involve unfolding of relations and processes. That said, across different disciplines, sensing and sense-making have increasingly been studied as multi-sensorial, multimodal, and multimedia. The simple links between sensory modalities, for instance, smell, and sense organs like the nose, have further been abandoned also with reference to learning. Sensuous scholarship has shifted its focus from analysis of singular senses and symbolism related to this to multisensory studies of practice and experience involving the senses and uses thereof as situated embodied movements. While learning has been implied to be key to historical and contemporary sensory processes of socialization, little sensory studies work has dealt with this in any detail. Histories of education, in turn, have only slowly started focusing on sensory aspects of learning, roughly 2 decades ago, and the scented world of education has thus far received scant attention, which is odd given the historical importance ascribed in Western educational thought to fresh air and sea, forest, heat, and other scents. Various health and outdoor education initiatives emerged from imaginaries of engagement with such smells as of the 1850s, amid rapid industrialization and urbanization. In what follows then, I will pay closer attention to some particular sensed worlds of education, and from there I will make a brief digression into forest school as currently given shape in the UK to highlight the relevance of such a seemingly marginal topic as smell in contemporary education contexts. My research question thereby is that of how smell has come to work educationally in practices and experiences enmeshed with symbolism in such contexts beyond the purely figurative in terms, for instance, of teaching and learning goals, methods, processes, and effects. And I argue that situated embodied movements related to the Institute's studies, bound up with imaginaries of order's childhood, still have tangible effects today, including hidden curriculum effects. Methodologically, I draw on both photographic and written materials as entranceways into a thick textured account of sensory experiences and practices. And the photos, some of which existed but still exist actually as postcards, for instance, are not just scrutinized for visual representation of smell, but rather as objects of effect for the expanded sensory realm of the social in which they were and are put to work. While it has been pointed to limits of photos in terms of sensual qualities they can capture, their ability to embody, enact, and elicit sensory and emotional engagements has also been recognized. Theoretically, all these sources use or approach as sensual materials entangled with other humans and non-humans. With reference to Karen Barat, they are analyzed diffractively through each other in search of differences that matter as both sensual substance and significance or sense as they interact with apparatuses, or rather other apparatuses of bodily production, such as sense organs and analytical tools like my own. Smell-related situated embodied movements are thereby analyzed as phenomena, the observed as entangled with the very agencies of observation. Now, the Belgian and Luxembourg open-air schools studied here, built on earlier 19th century sanitation reforms, smell, indeed as chemical substance and metaphor, gradually took center stage in urban imaginaries of filth, disease, and moral vice. And Corbin's study, Odor and the French social imagination, now sits firmly within a plethora of studies that have conjured up changing sensitivities to odor and malodor as of the 1820s, roughly, subsequently entangled with miasma, degeneration, and infection theories, though such a distinct disease association was never truly divorced. Indeed, smells retained importance during the early 20th century, when open-air schools emerged as such. In Belgium and Luxembourg, as for instance in Birmingham, at times they figured within an array of social welfare provisions, including urban sanitation and housing projects, bound up with disease prevention and child protection. This gave way to a certain colonization of the world of the poor and children with, as Ian Grosvenor has noted, class and ethnicity inflected descriptions of the slums that they inhabited, resembling those of the human zoos belonging to a wider colonial context. Slumming, he has shown, was a common phenomenon whereby smell featured prominently. This also goes for the Belgian and Luxembourg context here. Indeed, in 1907, these civic members wrote, "We have visited them, these small ones, in their sordid slums, in their dank upstairs rooms, in their narrow alleys and streets with their ever-lingering odor of poor people, skinny and pale, so withering and delicate." Smell thus functioned to co-produce pre-tuberculous children whose delicateness was ascribed to unhealthy multisensory exposure. In Luxembourg, around the same time, Alina Meyrich, wife of the general director of Arbeit, together with other women of an association for women's interests and members of a league for social and school hygiene, conducted surveys on the living conditions of the poor in the capital. From their reports, smell emerges as a key marker of poverty and disease, a threat above all to women and children. The latter allegedly had to vegetate as withered plants in humid dwellings without air or light. Data in this report in turn conjured up sensory images. Of a high number of dwellings inspected, for instance, 21.5% consisted of a single room. Lavatories left a particularly frightful mark, with entire streets having no toilet facilities whatsoever, as applied to 18% of the dwellings checked. In some cases, up to 37 families use a single toilet. As elsewhere, feces as matter and metaphor above all triggered the imagination. Thus, one report's entry noted, "In several houses, cesspits are to be found in the basement from which emanates a plague-like smell, or in the garden where they are covered with foul boards." Yet another entry stated, "Family with 8 children lives in their 1 room and 2 small spaces under the roof. Children collect dog droppings for tannery, bucket of them in the room, horrendous smell." Such vivid accounts, entangling people and places, material conditions, and particular smells, acted to create a sense of urgency to legal reform and state and private action, for instance, through open-air schools. Smell was inscribed in the very concept of this type of institute, defined at the first international conference on the subject as an educational institution situated outside of the city in favorable conditions of exposure. Rural fresh air was implied, and despite growing scientific skepticism about the healing powers of aromatics, pine and birch trees and heat, for instance, were still regularly accredited antiseptic properties. Smell mattered in more ways than on an atmospheric level in the Dieselweg and Arbet schools, though. To explore more material symbolic entanglement sense, I have diffractively analyzed the first photograph from a Dieselweg holiday camp held in Hamois, August 1900, 4 years prior to the opening of the open-air school, through earlier written sources of this school and its Luxembourg counterparts, specifically in relation to hygiene. Hygiene featured prominently in the Dieselweg holiday camps and open-air school, and those of Arbet as well, making up a key part of the initiative's non-formal education regimes. These help to affect particular senses of cleanliness and health in boys and girls recruited. Even in these liberal contexts, hygiene, as it regarded washing and sleeping and toilet visiting, saw the sexes separated and to some extent experienced gender-specific sensory education. Of course, these regimes aim to deodorize childhoods, targeting particularly body odors, but the initiatives analyzed here also work to affect reodorization of childhood, still explicitly at that time related to health on a physiological level. Sniffing with lust the salty sea breeze, the sharp mountain air, the balmy heat and forest smell. From this, children gain pure, strong blood and new life, one claims. The figurative matters as it reveals what was understandable and actionable, and while here it worked partly to ascribe powers to air and its sensory qualities that more expensive meatstuffs were understood to provide, this was further articulated in descriptions of moral and health education, grounded in the basic psychological principle that physiological principle that the body wears out. The strength of blood was thereby associated with food and air alike, and its purity with internal organs as well as sweat glands, urinating, bathing, and life in the open air. If air, mattering also through photographs photographs like this one shown here, was held to strengthen and purify, the same applied to water and soap children learned to apply to specific body parts. The soap of which the brand in this photograph is unknown, together with the water of the Bok River and greenery in the fore and background, conjured up a sense of freshness and cleanliness, with splashing water into one's face, letting soap and water foam into one's hands and hair, etc., being as much about touching and inspecting as about smelling. Thus the photo enacts multi-sensory imaginaries of the removal of dirt and malodor, and of refreshment and reinvigoration. Apart from soap, other modern commodities made for gendered sense experiences. In Dieselweg's open-air schools, for instance, girls' hair was regularly treated with a sabadilla tincture to prevent vermin. Boys did not receive such treatment, their hairs were just cut short. If fleas or lice still appeared, both boys and girls could be sprayed copiously with DDT powder. And regular changing of clothes was further to prevent undesirable smells, with children's parents being forced to wash their dirty linen every week. And windows, obviously, in open-air schools were normally kept open day and night. In short, smell, as both absence and presence, work to promote odorous childhoods in particular ways. At least initially, smell was thereby still seen as embodied, transforming children's very physiologies. Smell helped to and reodorize childhoods differently still through powerful associations around specific target groups. In the case of bedwetters, one spoke of filthy children who, in terms of their natural needs, were at the level of wild animals, persisting in a wicked vice. Blaming mothers for training young cats or dogs, but not their offspring, one instilled virtuous habits in them, adapting their dinners, for instance, in terms of liquids, and waking them up at night for toilet visits to prevent sensory discomfort, but also material damage. The Luxembourg schools cater to similar target groups, aged 8 to 12, an age range thought to be specifically prone to morbid conditions, what were called morbid conditions. Here, smell functions to exclude children. For instance, those afflicted with eczema, a disease of the nose causing an odor described as nauseating. Children with impetigo, a highly contagious skin disease causing blisters in the face from which pus oozes, and those suffering from incontinence. Often olfactory terms denoted a transformation unfolded. Languishing flowers could be seen to flourish and smell as the most fragrant bouquets of flowers. Greenery also mattered in the open-air schools within a colonial logic of primitivism attached to verdant pre-modern sites aimed at countering new urban lifestyles. Gardening thus often featured in open-air schools with an within an integral education based on object lessons grounded in direct observation of nature along multi-sensorial lines as part of a reduced curriculum. In the words of Diesterweg staff, it was above all a matter of teaching how to use the senses, to use them well, arousing attentiveness, sharpening judgments, teaching how to compare correctly. Active use of the senses had to leave a strong impression of moral or aesthetic sentiments. A photograph enacting multisensory engagement with nature for these purposes is that featuring a Diesterweg school teacher here surrounding by his supposed friends, teaching about the great diving beetle sometime in the 1940s. Glass bowls and an improvised fishing net hinted hands-on activity at a mere in the heathlands, with attentive looking, eager pointing, and the like constituting close observation within an object lesson aimed at instilling in children love of nature, understood here in a non-confessional sense. This was nurtured by allowing children to garden their own flower or vegetable plots, hoped to prevent the visiting of pubs and alcoholism in later life. And Bruce Curtis' concepts of dietetics here helps to illuminate how senses operated within a program promoting a sort of overall healthy moral lifestyle. Photos of natural sciences or gardening, as you can see here in this context, did not just act as illustrations to reports, but also as postcards, which often along with flowers found their way into children's homes, where they figured as where they served as tangible reminders of a sensed way of living. I'm noticing that I'm running a little bit behind, so I better hurry up. You can a sense of autochthonious middle-class homeliness arguably emerges from the photograph as both study object and educational purpose, bound up with sensory learning from this photograph scrutinized here. Groups of girls organized according to size, among whom no doubt some belonging to migrant families, can be seen posing around a plot of begonias, a type of flower not really known for its strong scent, but for its overall aesthetic appearance. Photographs like these then performed fragrance as part of an integral aesthetics. Along the lines of class and ethnicity, they helped to create distinct odorous childhoods deemed in need of sensory education. I'm going to skip the last part of the paper, the third photograph, if I'm able to move the slides. If I'm able to move, yeah, okay, the next slide. So that we have a bit of time to discuss the links between what I've studied historically and contemporary education. I want to have a quick word about forest school, which is a current form of outdoor provision gaining distinct popularity in the UK as what's called a specialized learning approach, adapted usually by nursery and primary schools as an add-on to the regular curriculum. And it's set to contribute, or it's often presented as offering all learners regular opportunities to achieve and develop confidence and self-esteem through hands-on learning experiences in a woodland or natural environment with trees. But its claim to relevance for all ages and client groups has been questioned. Coming in a great many forms, forest schools' frequent use for personal, social, and emotional aspects of learning and development nonetheless brings into view specific children, those with learning conditions like ADHD, for instance, and more generally the very young. In so doing, it co-creates childhoods deemed in particular needs of sensory education. And I'll come to my conclusion now. Going back to Karen Cerullo's suggestion that sense-making and meaning attribution through smell both constitute and are constituted by ways that cultural life is organized, from my study it can be said that smell has come to operate multisensorially while entangling experience and symbolism. Beyond deciphering information, sensing the world as situated embodied practice was affected by specific goals and methods, yielding various effects. For instance, reodorizing particular parts and aspects of children's bodies and promoting new senses of self and other in terms of purity and order, directing attention, judgment, and memory towards particular senses of aesthetics and morality fostering dietary senses of belonging, etc. From all this, I would argue, emerge odorous or rather sensuous childhoods, which is a concept I use to denote ways in which, along such lines as physical and mental condition, age, class, ethnicity, etc., very distinct target groups have come to be imagined but also created as in need of explicitly sensorial education, with not only beneficial effects, that's the important part, but also potentially harmful effects. I'd like to conclude my paper here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time. That was really fascinating paper, so thank you very much for that. I didn't mention at the start, but if you would like to ask a question of any of the speakers, we're using the Slido app, which should be to the right of your event screen. So if you type your question in there, I'll be able to see it and put it to our speakers. So take a little bit of time to do that. I'll start with the first question. It's slightly strange because I can't see your face, but I hope you can still hear me.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so the first question we've got is, you talk about multi-sensoriality in your paper, yes, but obviously you focus on smell. How do you theoretically include the other senses in your research? So although you focus on smell, I think the question is, to what extent or how do you take account of the other senses in your work? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, well, there's I have an historical answer to that in the first place. I think we forget how historically contingent the very notion of smell is. And so what we understand as smell is quite particular for our day and age, and hasn't always been the same. So that's already an historical answer to that question. Theoretically, it's just become from various studies, even sort of the hardcore sort of psychological research that look at neurons, etc. It's become clear that smell isn't what it's imagined to be, something with neurons, that get triggered or gets put to work through our nose, and of which the sort of the meaning is assembled in our brains in some way. So already there, so that very natural science kind of research establishes that those straightforward connections that we make aren't there, or aren't just there. There are other connections that are operating. And so theoretically, I guess, it makes more sense to think of smell, even the way we conceive of it today, as something that is really intimately bound up. We know that everyone knows that it's intimately bound up. For instance, in the case of taste, when you taste foods, smell comes into play. But that smell, your sense of smell, is affected by the textures you feel. And so it makes sense to configure smell as a phenomenon, if you like, in the Baratian sense, as something that is to do with sensations, but also with the way these sensations get conceived of. And so that is a nice mixture that then emerges, which we call smell.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, we've got a question about the challenges of researching the senses, in particular smell, through documentary sources, and whether or not that poses particular methodological challenges, and how do you get around that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very nice question. And I experienced those challenges, didn't I? Already, well, for all sorts of reasons, the references to smell are scarce. You don't find so many references to smell in the archival sources, in the written published sources. And it gets even more complicated when you work with photographs. But in a way, it's not that different from any way that we methodologically work with sources in general. we don't just take what, for granted what is at first sight, but we try to read between the lines, and in the same way we try to sort of get a sense of how our photograph was imagined to work, what it was imagined to do within a particular audiences that were, supposed to get exposed to that photograph. And so I try to work with the absences, the silences, as well as what is there, and sort of to use what I guess from other sources also can be understood to be taken for granted for the makers of the photograph, as well as the potential audiences they had in mind. Try to work with those kind of notions and then complicate things a little bit by, again, diffractively reading that analysis and sort of that account, that quasi-historical account, if you like, through other more critical contemporary analysis of photographs.
Thank you. I've just been told we've 3 minutes of the
yeah.
questions, so I'll read this and we'll try and get a couple more in. This one's actually from Debbie, so on the screen. So what do you think the implications of your research are for very recent history, perhaps in British or European cultures? So I think it's about what the implications of the history of the census are for sort of history, how we do history in general in these particular Western cultures.
I think the implications are profound. I think we underestimate how much we consider the sensory realm, and it's so much associated nowadays or recently in recent histories with childhood and with the very young, and how they learn potentially differently from adults. We sort of we're sort of acquainted with those benign associations of the sensory. The implications of my research are profound in a sense that I try, or at least I do my best to highlight how those seemingly benign associations with the senses and even smell actually work to co-construct particular target groups for which a specific kind of education is imagined and created. And so again, when that happens, the issue of streaming and setting, the creating of different streams for particular target groups comes into play, and that has potentially very negative consequences. It should be about inclusion, should matter for all, and not for particular target groups. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ed. And we have just run out of time for that section. Yeah, but thank you very much for your questions and for your answers. And so I think we can now move over to Debbie, who's going to introduce our second speaker. Thanks, Debbie. I think you're muted.
I am. Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Geert. That was a lovely presentation. I have the honor of presenting Dr. Yinka Olusoga, who is going to present today on sensory histories of the playground. Yinka is a lecturer in education and the course director of the BA in Education, Culture and Childhood at the University of Sheffield. Her research and teaching focus on discourses and histories of childhood and education, and on the co-construction of environments for children's play and creative engagement. Yinka is interested in children's creative and digital literacies and the intergenerational co-construction of play and storytelling. She is director of the British Academy Research Project Childhoods in Play, the Iona and Peter Opie Archive. She is a co-investigator on the ESRC-funded project, a National Observatory of Children's Play Experiences during COVID-19, known as the Play Observatory. This project is currently conducting a national survey of children's play during the pandemic. So could we please welcome Yinka for her presentation?
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie. So this is going to be, as Debbie says, talking about the research that we're currently doing, looking at the Iona and Peter Opie archive that has been partially digitised, that we're working through, and that's a British Academy funded project. And I'm particularly talking about how our current research is we're looking at the playground as a sensory place, and we want to develop sensory histories around the playground as a result of this project. So the archival collection is a huge one. So Iona and Peter OP were folklorists who were independent researchers and who gathered together a huge archival collection of items that underpinned their work on children's folklore. So the archive consists of around 100,000 items, 85 hours of sound recordings, and that were brought together in a roughly 30-year period between 1950 and 1980. And it includes contributions from about 20,000 children from all over Britain. And it's very eclectic. There are linguistic items. Children have written about games and rhymes, songs, lots of stuff about customs and rites of passage. And there's a subset of the archive is a collection of children's essays from the Camberwell Public Library's essays competition, which ran particularly in the 1950s and 60s. We have examples of. The archive at the moment is distributed between the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, the Folklore Society, and the British Library. So our project is a British Academy funded research project which began in 2012. And its first aim was to make the materials in the collection accessible by digitizing and cataloging what was what was there. We are still in the process of doing that, particularly the digitization. And the second aim was to promote research into histories of childhood and play and the playground. So we launched the OP Archive website in November 2019 at an event that was held at the Oxford University Press. And the past year and a bit is what I kind of want to talk to you about today. In particular, what we're doing this summer with 4 University of Sheffield undergraduates who have been undertaking research projects based on the archive that have been funded by the University of Sheffield. So we run 6-week competitive student research scholarships to work on real research. And we were fortunate enough to get 4 students who wanted to work on our archive and our project. So the current threads and direction of the project are really focusing on sensory histories and how they can be related, help us understand and approach the OP archive. So those 2 threads that we focus on in particular at the moment are this idea of contextualizing the collection and the people who contributed to the collection. The OPs didn't ask a lot of questions that we might ask about social research today. So we know, for example, with the contributions to their surveys, we know the schools that the children were contributing from. We know the gender of the child usually, and sometimes we know their name, but we don't know anything else about that social world, and we don't really know much about the schools themselves. So contextualizing that is a way of moving away from the archive and into that context around these pieces of paper that have been digitized and that appear on our website. And the second thread is continuing to digitize and catalogue the collection, but also promoting the use of their collection in education and research. And ideally what we want is this to be a resource that's obviously useful for researchers, but also useful for postgraduate and undergraduate teaching. As an ex-teacher myself, I think there are definitely aspects of the archive that would be very useful for schools to be using as well. I think there's a real connection that children can have when they're engaging in an archive about children where the entries are produced by children and are written from children's points of view. So that was kind of the underpinning of where we are with our current summer project. So we have 2 students who are looking at 2 specific OP contributor schools. And the work they're doing is including tracing child contributors for some oral history work. The stimulus for that came over the winter period, when we were actually contacted by a man who now lives in North America, and he was an OP contributor. He'd come across the OP website and he got in touch with us to say, I remember doing this, I remember writing these things and it being sent off to the OPs, and could we find his contribution so that he could see it? And we did manage to find his contribution. And he was also then talking about how interested he'd be in talking about it further, and that he had friends who still live up in Bishop Auckland, where his school was, who would be also perhaps interested. So that was a good stimulus to get us thinking, well, actually, that was one school. And then we had another student who lives in London, and she looked at some of the material and has also chosen a school where she grew up that she's investigating at the moment. The other 2 students are looking at 2 of the essay themes from the Camberwell essays. So the way the competition ran, schools allowed children to submit their entries to the essay competition to the Camberwell Public Libraries in the 50s and 60s. And each year there was a theme or a number of themes that were given for children to write their essays to. So I'll talk about those in a little while. So in each of these projects, so the contributor projects and the Camberwell essay projects, what we really want to be able to do is to follow lines of inquiry out from the texts in the archive. So we're starting from this written archival material, mostly written, there are some images, but we want to move out and from that construct a more layered and in-depth understanding of the contexts and the lived experiences of the child contributors that, are then preserved for us in just these little small pieces of paper, which I'll show you in a second. So this book that I've been reading in the past few months has really helped to crystallize some of my thinking around this. So this is about by Rob Boddice and Mark Smith, looking at, and it's called Emotion, Sense and Experience. It was published last year. Now, when I did my PhD, I started from a point of view where discourse was what I was really interested in, and I analysed data from historical data using a form of critical discourse analysis. But actually, as I went through my PhD and towards the end of my PhD, I began to feel some of the limits of discourse. And I was very much interested in some of the more post-humanist ideas about embodiment and entanglement. And so I think I was kind of moving towards this direction. And I'd noticed in some of the work that I really enjoyed reading, and also in some of my data, sensory history was a really important theme. In some of the data I was looking at, children were being talked about in ways that were very judgmental, and the threads of argument that supported that were very much linked to the senses. But this book I found fascinating because this is bringing together 2 different types of history. Rob Boddice is a historian of the emotions. Mark Smith is very much into sensory history, and they met at an event and actually started to think about how their ideas actually complemented each other and could work together to produce a really much more nuanced and useful and rich approach to ideas around creating and recreating understanding of children, particularly, well, not just children, people's lived experiences, and how we can engage with that, and to the extent to which we can engage with that through archives and historical material. So there's a number of quotes there that I've pulled out of the book that I found particularly helpful. And I think this idea that we're talking about trying to capture and evaluate how the body and the senses and the emotions and the mind are all entangled, and actually that's okay. And it made me think to what extent some of the approaches I've taken in the past to kind of try to disentangle that, while actually putting it all together and understanding it in this kind of more textured, nuanced way, they argue propels us to this fuller, more textured understanding of practices of being human. And this idea about thinking about how being human is meaningful experience was very useful. And I particularly like this idea about thinking of the human as brain, body together, not being in the world, but being of the world. So the idea that, you know, we are embodied and that is how we experience the world, I think is really, really helpful, particularly in the context of play. So if we go to the archive, and this is an example from one little girl writing about her experience, and I think that's really lovely. And when I read that, I very much could picture, and actually to some extent feel the echoes of the feelings of playing a very similar game. The language I thought was lovely about, you get puffed very soon. That took me back very much to my playground experience. So there's senses there, there's touching, and there is movement, and there's stretching, and there is shouting. There is stuff happening there. So the playground is a sensory place. So I just been thinking, if you want to interact with this, when you read something like that, does that invoke and provoke any thoughts and feelings for you? Does that description connect in any way with your own memories of the school playground? So this is a chance to interact in this presentation. Do these memories that you're perhaps tapping into, having read that little girl's experience, do they have emotional aspects or sensory embodied aspects, or both? And I just wondered if you could share a key word or phrase that captures some of your response. So I'll give you a moment to have a go at that and see if that makes sense for you. I think you should be able to see a Slido thing coming up. So yes, does that entry in the archive, that description of play, evoke any thoughts or feelings for you? So just a word or a phrase that you would like to share, you can type that into Slido. One thing I realised, it took me a while to notice it, was that when I was reading some of these descriptions, it was almost like having a flashback. But then I realised I'm having a flashback to my own playground. So I feel like I'm understanding her experience, but actually I'm contextualising it in my own experience and my own place. So my memories of play are very situated. So yes, definitely lots of emotions and nostalgia. And I think most people who come up, against the archive and start reading it, do tend to come up with that. And comfort, yes. I think there is a great comfort in knowing that actually, yes, we had those shared experiences, that actually this was something that we can all kind of have a response to. I think it's also important to point out that for some people, that might not be a positive emotion that they're experiencing. They might be experiencing the fact that they were not included in that type of play. And that can be very problematic for people to think about and deal with. But thanks for that. I'm going to move on now back to the slides, but thank you for your sharing. So the other idea I took from Bodis and Smith was the idea of situated worlds. And they talk about really understanding that taking this approach raises this question of context, relationality, materiality, encounter and interaction. And I think that, as a phrase, the playground absolutely is a place where all of this is happening. And they argue that understanding situated worlds is essential to the history of experience. Simon Slate describes experience as the feel and fabric of everyday life, the texture of the past that resides in between context and text. And I think that's really beautiful. And he also argues for using the idea and the concept of experience rather than agency when talking about children, because a lot of what happens to children isn't necessarily agentic in a classical sense, it's actually experiencing. And that really spoke to me, particularly thinking about my own playground experience as a child. So this is a school I attended in Gateshead, Brighton Avenue Primary School. This is a map of it. And again, from Bodison Smith, understanding the playground as a situated world of relations, inclusion and exclusion is very important. The playground is where I learned I wasn't white and that I was black, and that actually then came with a set of other information that I was not aware of until I entered the playground. So having thought about that, how does this help us with our work? So our current projects, we have a student looking at Copton Hill School in Bishop Auckland, and they're looking at how children wrote about the way they played inside and outside of school, the banter they exchanged, the songs that they sang. Gender is really coming across from the data here, and in particular how the children experienced and understood masculinity. So that's what that student is focusing on. The student who's at the Oratory Catholic School in Chelsea is looking at how children talked about their favourite games that they like to play alone or with other children. What's really nice about this set of data is that younger children drew pictures of their play. And so we're using that project to examine the themes of religion, social class and friendship, but also thinking about the how drawings of play happened. So our next steps are conducting the oral histories, and we're hoping to also develop intergenerational conversations, particularly the Bishop Auckland School. We've got generations of families who went to the same school. So we're using OS maps of schools and their playground and the surrounding areas as provocations for discussion about the cultural worlds of school playgrounds. We're collecting from the contributors photographs, maps, drawings of their schools and their neighbourhoods. And we're building outwards again from that text in order to provide a space for respondents to articulate in multimodal ways the situated worlds of the playground, school and street of their childhood play and culture. The Camberwell essays, two themes that are being developed at the moment are the theme All About My Neighbourhood in 1955 and Comics again in 1955. It's really useful because we've got this collection of essays. We'll now be able to map which schools sent which types of which essays, and we've already started seeing differences in the way the children in the much more suburban areas of Camberwell were sending rather than the more urban areas. And with comics, so much multimodal stuff already in the archive and the data, talking about how the comics felt and smelt, how lurid the colours were, and really thinking about them as tangible objects that inform the play practices. So the next steps for that project is creating a teacher's guide to the Camberwell essays, which will help contextualise it and to construct those layers of school, area, regional and national information that allows us to draw, again, lines of inquiry from the text and make it come alive for people who engage with the archive. So finally, as we go forward in the research, we really want to think about this idea of feel, fabric and texture, but also see playgrounds as not only situated, but intersectional worlds of experience. So yes, that their sensory is embodied, discursive, emotional, relational, spatial, but also that different children will experience the same playground in very different ways. Going back to my own school, that is the school my mother attended and my grandfather attended. It's not the same, it's the same physical space, but our experiences were very different because of gender and race. And so finally, we're looking at expanding the archive to think about playground experience of migrant children and of third culture kids. What is it like to, and how do these things come together to create the situated world of the playground, and how can we capture that multimodally? So that's the end of my talk. Those are my references. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Yinka. That was a brilliant presentation, and I know that you've given us all a lot to think about. There are a few questions that have been posed, and I'm wondering if you would take some time to answer them for us. So Mavis Brew would like to know, do the schools or your study include children with additional language and communication needs and or special needs children?
This is exactly the question we want to ask, and the OPIs didn't actually collect that kind of information. We have come across some in the archive. So one of the students last week got very excited and brought this wonderful essay that had been written by a child in Camberwell about my neighbourhood, and he's talking about his neighbourhood, and beautifully written. And you're on page 2, and he just mentions the fact that he walks past a group of children who call him racist names, and he's very used to being called them, and he just ignores them. And so it's really, and it's very, it just comes out of nowhere from that. So although that's what we want to find out, we want to find out more about the contributors so we can find out exactly who they were and what kind of spread of ethnicity and social class and things like disabilities that they had. And also, ideally, what we'd like to do is, if we find that there isn't that much and not many contributors do actually reflect childhood in the time, we want to go back to schools and to perhaps areas who didn't contribute to the original OP archive, and to correct that, to ask people about their experiences. I've taught in various places in the country, and that's something that really struck me. I went from a very multicultural school in Birmingham as my first teaching job to a monocultural school in Knowsley outside Liverpool. And so, yeah, where is the difference, and how does that impact on how children experience the playground? What does it bring to the playground when there is that diversity?
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk about the methodological challenges of oral history in a modern age.
Well, it's been interesting because obviously we're having to do everything COVID safe at the moment, which means everything is on via Zoom and things like that. I think it's very helpful that we've been doing this for a year now, so that people are much more open and okay with it. And it's asking, which platform would you prefer, is the kind of conversation you have now with people. But so far that they've been going well, and the conversation, and we tried to do it in a conversational way, I think, because I think the nature of the questions needs to be like that. But also I think it's realizing that when you're asking people to think back on their childhood, there's a lot of emotional baggage, and actually some stuff that might come to the surface that they've forgotten. And I think most people tend to think about the playground and play as being this wonderful positive experience, but for a lot of children, it can be quite a dark place to be, and it can be quite excluding. So we've tried to do it in ways that it's not kind of a questionnaire, but it is, setting the scene. Having the contribution really helps, so that's a starting point. But that's why we want to have the multimodal. We've been collecting things like OS maps that show the school and the area, and that's been very helpful because that's brought up lots of, the walk to school. And this is what we did, and we climb along that wall and we jump off here and we pretend to be pirates around the corner. So I think that's very, very helpful. So thinking about the environment around the school and helping people to visualize and remember those things, those details, has been very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Heather, did you have a question? You looked like you were ready to ask something.
Yeah, it's a question about one of the quotes that you had on a slide from the Boddice and Smith book about historians not being able to re-experience or reenact the past, but reconstruct it.
Yes.
And that is, I think the idea is that it's obviously, that's quite a bold statement of the limitations of what the historian's able to do. So I think it's just, what are your thoughts on that quote, and how have they shaped the design of the project going forwards? I think
we've really thought about it in case of reconstruction. And I suppose this goes back to kind of a more kind of post-humanist Deleuze and Guattari type approach. It's about bringing together an assemblage of information that will help contextualize it. I don't think we can absolutely recreate and get people to reenact, and we have thought about that. And in the Bishop Auckland School, it's still standing, the same actual school. And so I really would like eventually to get people to come back to the playground and stand and talk about it. And those intergenerational conversations, I'd love them to take place in the playground. But I do think what we're trying to do at the moment is we realise that it's always going to be partial. So I think this idea of reconstruction is saying that's okay. But what we're doing is providing these different layers that we can engage with, that perhaps will trigger and help us to think about and perceive certain things in particular ways that will be evocative and illicit. Because I think memory floats to the surface when it's, tempted to by the senses and by emotion.
Thank you. Just one final small factual question. It's about who you're going to be actually interviewing the oral histories. Is it just the pupils, or is it also the staff and the support staff and the whole sort of situated world of this?
Yes, obviously the children are still alive. Most of the staff sadly aren't. We have actually been in touch with the son of the head teacher, who was the head teacher when the Opis things happened at the school. He's also a head teacher. And so, that's been really interesting. So obviously we can't necessarily usually talk to staff, but we are trying to trace contributors, but also then once we engaging with, most schools have some kind of Facebook page or something, or society, and we're engaging with people who also went to the schools at the same time or before or after, to try and again help to build up that picture.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are slightly over time, so sorry about that. No, because I think it is quite finely balanced. So I think we'll thank you very much, Inka, again for your talk, and I'll come back to Debbie to introduce our third and final speaker.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather. I have the very great pleasure of introducing Karen Duell. I work with Karen, and Karen is a principal lecturer at the University of Roehampton, specializing in primary history. She is a fellow of the Historical Association. She is a chartered teacher of history and writes extensively for the Primary History Journal. She is also active in promoting history through workshops, webinars, and conference seminars. Karen is co-author of Mastering Primary History, published by Bloomsbury, as well as professional and peer-reviewed journal article and book chapters. Karen has been involved in a number of fellowship projects, including a Holocaust Teacher Fellowship with the Imperial War Museum and Transatlantic Teacher Fellowship with the National Archives, working with international colleagues to explore 20th century history. She is recently involved with supporting a teacher fellowship CPD program developed by the Historical Association. Her most recent publication is a chapter in Arts Education in the Primary School by Susan Ogier and Susie Tatchell. Could I welcome Karen to this afternoon's event?
Thank you very much, Debbie. I think that my talk this afternoon is going to be more practitioner than research-based. And what I'd like to do is to give you some idea of how we use artifacts, objects, sensory stimuli when we are working with our student teachers to enable them to feel more confident in using the same with their class. Now, I'm not entirely sure where I'm clicking for this to move onwards. Thank you very much. So to start off with, how do we see the objects that might have a link to history. We may be thinking about archaeological evidence that we might be looking at with children. We might be looking at wider evidence of material culture. So thinking about these ideas from Jordanova and Eris Ferrier and Iga Vivanakos, what are the key elements that shape these ideas, and how are they complementary or dissimilar? We're looking at this idea of objects that demonstrate lives, people's lives, pieces of history that have been left behind. But there's also this affective element, this link to the personal, how people feel about those objects, what they might care to keep. And you can see a very sad little dog here, sad little old dog, teddy bear, that stirs and reminds us of perhaps objects that we have ourselves. So there is that link between those objects that we're looking at that are representative of the past, and those links to our own understanding. Okay, so next one. Thank you. So thinking again what we'd like to do with the students and with the children here when we're using objects and artifacts with them. Clearly our idea is to make sense of that fragmentary evidence, to contribute to that reconstruction that Yinka was just talking about, to use those pieces to make sense of the past, and to engage in some sort of inquiry-based learning. Because while there is a focus at the moment within education in England to turn towards knowledge-based learning, there is still a place to play for inquiry-based learning with children. So taking up sources to build a picture of the past, and also to recognise what we can learn from those objects and why they're a useful source. Things that we can tell from objects: weight, mass, size, smell, texture, colour, sound. What sound does it make? And so there are elements that those objects bring that we don't find in other ones. But central to everything that we're trying to do within primary education is also to inspire, inform, educate and excite. So to really engage the children in that, and in order to do that we have to help our students understand that as well. Thank you. So we have then, I have some work here from my colleague Keith Andrietti, who many history subject leaders in the southwest of London knew as the artifact man, who came from a museum background. And again, he reiterates that importance of artifacts within our lives. The structured investigation can come later on, but we want to attempt to read that text. And here, where we're talking about illustrations as a text of history, but as texts in themselves, a text that can tell us things that we can learn nowhere else. One of the objects that I've used with students and with children is the ubiquitous flat iron. So the flat iron, compared to a modern iron, or compared to have an electronic iron, as well as a little series of irons. But the flat iron in itself, without that artifact, without actually picking that object up, you have no idea of its weight. You cannot tell what it weighs by looking at it. You can only tell what it weighs by experiencing it, by picking it up and feeling it, by investigating the smoothness of the bottom. Why is the bottom smooth? Well, clearly there's a reason for it. What has it not got? There's no little holes for the steam to come out of. So the questions that are generated by the investigation of that object are ones which we won't get in the same way if we're looking at a picture of it or reading a description of it. So that sensory investigation is absolutely central and will give us information from all sorts of other groups of people and ideas that we might not get in other ways. Thank you. So thinking then about what we would like the children to take away from it, we want them to begin to understand how to make sense from these objects, not to look for immediate answers, but to begin to draw some conclusions from what they're finding out about. How does this link to other things? What can I infer? What can I see? What do I know? What can I infer? What does this tell me? What does it not tell me? In discussing as well underrepresented groups, we may have artifacts from groups of people where we don't have a lot of documentary evidence. So the role of the story of women's lives is well explained, particularly lives of poorer women, through the objects that were part of their everyday lives. Likewise, different ethnic minorities. And here we've got a comparison potentially with the known, with similar objects that are used by different groups of people and at different times. We are developing this ability to draw inferences. The objects will not tell us everything that we want to know. We have to begin to ferret out the answers ourselves. So we need to make use of close observation. Where we're working with the children, we would be looking at what do the children see? What's their observation? And for young children, they'll just tell you what they can see or what they can feel, or what it smells like. And it's very linked to that direct sensual investigation. Once they start beginning to say, I think because, then we've moved them on to a different stage, and they're beginning to make those inferences. And then we would want them to select and combine information. What's the important bit of this object? Does this object link to something else? And then to begin to evaluate it. And certainly when you're looking at these sorts of things with children, they will come out with the most amazing ones. I have also a rather lovely wick trimmer, which the children used to call the bent scissors. And I had a child in year one describing the scissors, and they wrote, here are the scissors. The scissors is made of iron. The scissors is bent. The scissors is old. The scissors do not bounce. There's only one way you can know whether the scissors bounce or not, isn't there? Never actually saw it happening, but clearly it had. We also want to encourage them to discuss and debate to find out the different ideas that we've got. And it may be that there's something as small as a Roman coin that can generate a tremendous amount of information in relation to trade, to empire, to emperor, to technology, how was it made, to geographical spread, why have we got these here, to worth, is this an expensive coin? No, but why are there so many less expensive coins to be found? Because people were, prepared to throw them away or lose them, and it didn't matter so much. Who might have used it? What might they have used it for? What could it buy? So a whole ream of questions that might generate some investigation into the Romans from beginnings of a small artifact. Thank you. So thinking about here, one of the key elements is that we have to ensure that students understand is that the process needs to be scaffolded, that there's not some magical skill that children have for investigating artifacts or deducing information. We have to help provide a system for them to make sense of it. It doesn't happen by osmosis. This close analysis is fundamental. Jordan Never talks about a close visual analysis, but I would also say that it's also a sensual analysis as well, because we want them to be feeling the objects. We want them to smell the objects. We don't want them licking things, though. We'll pass on the licking. But that very close investigation is important. So this passes on to what Turner Bissett's saying here. Now, a couple of the drawbacks with it. One of the things that Arias Ferres and Eniga Viviancos found was that when they initially started working with children, and certainly I've also found this true to be with student teachers, that there is the initial view can be dismissive. They can look at it, oh, that's interesting, and then pass merrily onwards. So again, that comes back to this point here about a process that will scaffold that learning and move them beyond this dismissive cursory glance. Arias and Ferres and Agius and Vivacos's research demonstrated that once children have begun to develop the skills that they needed to interrogate the objects, that they began to have more interest in those objects. What they also found, and one of the things that we need to be aware of, is this idea of moving too quickly towards the idea of function. Because once children have worked out what they think something is, they may well just switch off at that point, even if you show them it couldn't possibly be that. So it's important to work your way through towards that as a later stage. Okay, thank you. What I'd like you to do now is to explain some of the backgrounds of which I'm working with. Thank you. So I work at the University of Roehampton. We have a PGCE program and an undergraduate program. I work not exclusively, but primarily with the undergraduates. All of the students will come to me for 8 hours of history in year 1. Some will come for additional stuff in year 2, some will come for additional stuff in year 3, and I have history specialists who will come to me in year 2 and 3. But as you can see, the majority, some of them may only come to me for these 8 hours in year 1, and that is all they will get in order to prepare them to teach history in schools. So my job is one of really sowing the seeds that I hope will grow later on as they move through. Thank you. What considerations do I need to have? Students may come to us who stopped doing history themselves in year 10. So when they were, well, about 13 or 14, and they haven't missed it since, and yet they're going to have to teach it in schools. There is, without a shadow of a doubt, an appalling lack of subject knowledge, despite the fact that they will have had education up until that point in history. There is still a basic groundwork lack of subject knowledge. For some of them, there is disinterest. This is yet another element of the course that they have to fulfill. And so my primary aim is to engage, involve, and stimulate those students. And to do that, we've we have a room, the history room, and we have displays, and we have artifacts, and we have images, and we try to make it as visually attractive as we can. It promotes the identity of history within the university, within the program, and we try to create a stimulating environment with actual artifacts as much as possible, rather perhaps than reproductions. I do, when I go into schools, often see a table. They might be doing toys if they're in younger classes, or the Aztecs in an older class. No, not the Aztecs, the Inca, the Maya, or the Romans, or ancient Egypt, and there'll be a series of reproduction artifacts there. And those in themselves are not bad, but obviously they're not as good as the real thing. And often they're not used, they're merely there. They're not necessarily investigated, they're not used to help make sense of the past. They're there to illustrate the past, which is what Keith was identifying. I also find, therefore, that the teaching that I do needs to be quite physical, quite active, and we will be working in groups. So you can see my history room there, and some of the students who appear to be actually enjoying themselves at that point. I used to start off in the first session talking about what is history. Alison Hales, who's a history educator in Greenwich, was talking one day. She said, we used to do that, but now I give them some artifacts, and I ask them to investigate those first and then talk about what they think history is. And I would say that I would definitely suggest that's a good way to go. That's certainly something that I've then tried with my students, and I found that students have been more engaged. So we're looking at, well, our focus is the 1920s, and I have a number of artifacts: a gramophone, typewriters, cameras, sewing kits, books on sewing, tea sets, cocktail glasses, dressing tables set, all that are to do with the period. And we have a look at those. Thank you. If we can talk about what we're doing next. So I ask them to select one of the artifacts to focus on, to investigate that artifact, and that means playing with the keys, pushing the little bell, discovering, my goodness, how do I move things about on the page? You can't do that. Where's the ink in it? No. What is the bell for? Why does this move? So they spend a lot of time actually just exploring the objects, talking about the objects, then devising an inquiry question that they might want to find out, and getting a response from the other students. Thank you. We have a carousel. We look at the construction and technology. And what we're trying to think about is, what does this tell you about people's lives at that time? So we have to go beyond just playing with them. So what does it tell us? What comparisons can we draw from looking at this? What impression does it give you of this period? What are characteristic features? Is there anything that we can trace through? Thank you. We also then get them to create some 3D representations as an end product to reflect on what those characteristic features might be. We link it to specific vocabulary would have been used at the time, and we get them to try to think about, why was this significant? What does this tell us about what is going on at this particular point, and why this is significant? I have to say, this is one of their favourite bits. They love cutting and sticking and drawing with coloured pens. They're very happy when they're doing that. But this also provides this models the sort of activities that they could be doing with children in school themselves. Thank you. And then we use this process, we go through this process for making sense, the structure for making sense of, you can move the mouse, you can move it with the mouse or your keyboard, okay. Structure, so what is it made of, how has it been made, characteristic features, etc., etc., and working our way through to the end point where we're looking at the social purpose, what does it say about the people that they had this thing, and then the actual, what does this thing do? And so this is what we can use with children to help structure that investigation. Thank you. Let's see. We also wanted to use other senses as well, and wanted to get students to engage with more embodied learning. So these are 2 videos that we attempted to use to learn how to do the Charleston. I have to say this was something that was massively unsuccessful because many of them were really not very keen to attempt anything like this in front of their peers, even though I was prepared to make a complete idiot of myself. Okay, and then finally we look at Tutankhamun, we look at Tutmania, we listen to music from the period. This is the good old King Tut, which I won't play because we don't have time to listen to it. But one of the things that I do here as well is I have a box, and within the box, so it's made to look like an entry to a small area. It's got a little hole that you can look through, and on the back we've used some of the contemporary photographs taken, stuck onto the back, and there's a little flickery light in there, and what we would be doing here would be this reconstruction potentially of what might be seen. So we have the eyewitness accounts, we have the photographs, but then we have this ability that we might do with children. Ideally, I would love to turn part of the room into it and have a great big one and crouch in and look at it, but to begin to help students see how they might use this awe and wonder element of it. Okay, thank you. So I want to move away from the 1920s now for something really exciting. That's what I say to the students when I present my two pieces of Roman pottery, 1st century Roman. So yeah, I've got something really exciting to show you now. Their faces are just absolutely comic. So like, okay, she's lost it.
Karen, sorry,
yep.
Just to interrupt. You've got 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm rushing then.
No, I didn't. Sorry.
No, thank you. I see. Yes. So is it really real? Is it really that old? Can I really touch it? That's what children will talk about. The connection with the reality of the past and the connection with the reality of the people in the past is what will excite children. I use it as a starting point. Thank you. For next one, please. Thank you. Working around some role play around pottery. I have a character created who is a merchant from 1 Pulteney Street. He's importing Samian ware, green glass. He sets up in 60 AD, and as you probably know, Boudica arrives relatively soon after that. The dilemma is, what does he do? Does he stay? Does he leave? What happens? We know that there was a potter there, and I get the students to engage in some role play there, at which point they discover that it's really difficult to do if you don't have some background knowledge. Thank you. Rushing even more swiftly through. This is linked to Islamic civilizations, which is another one we look at, which is to do with the trade, using maps, trade routes, maps of caravanserais. And then if we go on to the next one, I have objects. so linking to trade and pilgrimage, and we've got semi-precious stones. You can probably see carnelian and jade and coral, lapis, Chinese silk, Indian silk, porcelain, some cobalt glass from Iraq, from Afghanistan, sandalwood, cedar wood, spices, cardamom, cumin, peppers, cloves, cinnamon, and then, as you can see here, frankincense and myrrh. I have to say Amazon is my friend and got much from there, but to have the students smelling the objects, feeling the objects, and then placing them in place. Thank you. This is one that we've done very recently. We had to adapt for lockdown, and we adapted using the idea of a mantelpiece. So we provided them with information about mantelpieces, things to look at, things to link. The Museum of the Home, which was the Jeffreys Museum, has also been looking at this, and we asked the students to create their own mantelpieces. Thank you. This is one that a student did with her daughter, and you can see the daughters created their model of what they would put. How do I use this to show my own identity? And then they were investigating, the child was looking at the story of Florence Nightingale in history, so she's created Florence's mantelpiece as well. So it's getting them again to think about objects and what objects mean to us and how we select those objects. Finally, yeah, last one, I think. Then we've got some comments here, linking back perhaps to my first point in terms of those objects, why they are important to us, and that affective domain. You can see, you know, I discovered my great-great-grandfather was the first Indian to be awarded the Victoria Cross. This and that links also perhaps to what Yinka was talking about in relation to the reconnection with people from the past. In this at this point, it's the people, it's immediate families that students were talking to. It helped me feel connected to my own past and have an idea of what the world was like when my mum was a child. And that is really one of the key things that we were wanting them to look at. And so finally, well, so why do I use them with primary trainee teachers? This stimulating their interest in it, highlighting the importance of using it, modelling and scaffolding methods for it, and demonstrating how we can use them across a number of areas of study, but linking always back to those people that have engaged in using those artifacts for us. Thank you. Oh, I've got my... Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Karen, for a very, very interesting presentation. There are a number of questions in the chat, so if you would be happy to answer them, I will. So Lynn Dag asks, going around a Roman wall fort with my parents, and I wondered why they built houses without a roof. How can we deal with misconceptions like this?
I would, I was thinking, why is she, yeah, I'm with you now. She realized they had lost the roof. I would be using reconstructions with children. There are a lot of computer reconstructions that we have nowadays that have been built using archaeological evidence, which help children visualize what the things would have looked like at the time. I think it's very true if you go to a cathedral or a monastery, and all you can see are the bones of it. So you can walk the bones of it, you can feel the things that remain, but you would also want to supplement with other imagery to help them visualize what it was like originally.
Okay. And then we have another question here. What are the emotional implications to children considering their diverse backgrounds?
I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to use a variety of artifacts with children, to allow children to bring in objects that might come from their homes and their backgrounds, to show how, so for example, with my flat iron, one of the children in one of the classes that I was working with said, and they were from somewhere else, they had come to Britain, and they said, my mum used something like that once. So there are experiences that they might have had which will feed in, and that validates those experiences for those children, but also engages the other children as well.
Okay. And then I have a very quick question. You mentioned that a lot of primary trainees have not taken history, or do not have an awful lot of historical knowledge. How do you build that historical knowledge while using the artifacts?
What I can do in terms of building their historical knowledge is quite limited because of the time constraints that I have. So I would use the artifacts as a jumping off point to begin then to talk about the rest of the objects and to send them away to find out some more information about those different places, and those, just to widen it out. So the artifact might be the starting point that will then pull them into that period or that time, and then they're going to have to do a little bit more to discover some more of it. Because you are correct, you can't understand there is only a certain amount that you can understand in relation to that object if you don't have some of the additional subject knowledge to make sense, to make more sense of it. You can, you know, if you've got a coin, you can say, well, I think it's a coin because it looks like a coin, and it seems to be this color, and it seems to weigh this amount. But it's only when you can begin to understand what the writing means and what the pictures might mean that you, and therefore begin to put it into that wider context, that you can really make sense of it.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think we have enough time now for a quick panel discussion. Am I not correct, Heather?
Yes, we do. And thanks, Karen, very much for that. I think we've done the whole arc from a sort of specific research project in sensory history through a project which looks both kind of backwards to research or sideways to research and then sideways to practice, and then a real practitioner focused paper as well. So that was really nice, and I think they cross-relate really in interesting ways. So yeah, we have about 20 minutes for questions which relate to any paper or all the papers together. So we would ask delegates to put their questions in Slido if they have questions for a specific speaker or more than one speaker. And while giving people a chance to do that, we've got a couple of questions from earlier that I guess we could start with. One that's been emailed to me, which is quite interesting. Not sure why, but I'm not going to be discriminatory. I'll ask it anyway. This is a question about how we relate the individual and the collective, individual and collective experiences through the senses. And I think this is something that probably is for all three speakers. It's not been directed to a particular person, because, so I suppose sort of hear it from the point of view of researching individual and collective experiences as sort of separate research objects, I guess, but also in a practitioner sense. Obviously, children learn collectively in the classroom or work with each other collaboratively. So how do we think about the pedagogical implications of the relationship between the individual and the collective? I'm sorry, it's very theoretical for this time on a Friday. I apologise. Would anyone like to have a go at that one? No.
I could say that one of the things that we're trying to do with the OP archive is just to question who the collective is. You know, because I think you can take that as a given. And as I've kind of hinted before, you know, we have this shared connection to place if you have lived in the situated world of your particular playground. But I think there are limitations to that as well. So I do think it's interesting when people engage with the archive how much they remember themselves, but then they also remember their connections to other people. So I do think in researching one, you end up researching the other.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to think along with the question. I can't help but put my Karen Barat hat on. Think of it sort of from a post-humanist perspective, like in terms of, you know, individual and collective experience, how they relate. How I see collective experience in a Baratian framework is that it's to do with condensations of, you know, sort of iterative configurations, I guess, it's a making sense that condenses, I would say, and which is why, you know, in a particular place we can all sort of share or bring about the shared idea of what it is to smell or what it is to touch and what you can win out of that, what you can gain from that. But it's very contingent. It's very contingent on time and space, because both time and space get reconfigured in the process as well. And so what it is to sense individually and collectively keeps changing, I guess, because of those new condensations of meaning making, sense making that emerge in each, through or with each time and space.
And I think if you're trying to develop this with children, then I think it is about the environment that you engender within your classroom that allows for space and time to be able to have those sorts of discussions with children, and the trust that enables children to bring in where there are different experiences, and to be able to share those different experiences, and then to draw from those different experiences what is the essential same, and what are the differences and why those differences are there.
Thank you. Okay. This is a bit of a mean one, but I think it's interesting. It's about the idea of the classroom as a space where senses are controlled, so that about imposing sort of authority and power relations within the classroom through the imposition of things like silence, probably the most familiar one, but also controlling what visual and material objects and cues are presented to children. I'm just wondering what I think it's relevant. Everyone thought about the possibilities for children to sort of reverse that picture and actually use sensory input and also their own senses to develop a sense of agency in their learning. And for here, I think that can be historically as well, because I know you've looked at children's experiences and grappled with some of those questions. Yeah, it's a bit of a hard one. I think that. I don't know who would like to have a go. Yeah.
I really like the question, particularly also because I've just recently been involved in sort of a midterm evaluation, PhD evaluation for someone who is studying music and sort of trying to make sense of how music interacts with primary school pupils and makes their everyday lives and experiences. And so I think we look at it the wrong way if we think of schools being controlled in sensory ways by teachers alone. I think children have a lot of control over sensory experiences as well. For instance, also in just defining what is silence and what is sound. the student, for instance, in question, she drew on sort of notes that she made in classrooms, and was struck sort of from her musical experience by how much silence there was, but then started paying attention to bodily movements and to all kinds of ways that children fidget, move chairs, use opportunities to do little dances, etc. And it just helped her actually realize how things that she wouldn't have previously anticipated to be part of a musical experience actually are. And actually, can either be framed as sound or as noise. So I think there's a lot of agency that comes about in the interaction between,
I think I would say that unfortunately we are living in England in rather a prescribed environment in schools. That you might go into a classroom where visually it appears as if there's a lot happening, but it's shaped in particular ways, and it's just, there's a lot of words. There are words everywhere and numbers, and they don't mean anything, and nobody ever looks at them. And I would like to see many more images in schools, and I would like to hear music used and sound used in schools much more, to give the children some agency, to allow them to occasionally move around as well when they want to. It happens in nursery classrooms. Children in free flow classrooms make decisions about where they want to go, what they want to learn. The early years practitioners are aware of the importance of visual stimuli, of oral stimuli, of having interesting objects that smell and touch and feel differently. But it seems that the minute we begin to get into a situation where the expectation of aiming towards a certain achievement within literacy and numeracy means that everything else is sublimated towards that, sadly. So
I'd have to
and
agree.
for the early years there.
Yeah, as another early years person, I'd agree. And I'm an early years person who's now the parent of a teenager, so I'm having to learn. And I think it's fascinating how this dominant paradigm of control, I think, is actually addictive. And I think once you kind of get into that mindset, you seek to control more and more. And that takes an awful lot of time and effort. And it's actually dehumanizing. We're in an online conference and it's lovely, but I do miss face-to-face. And if I think of every conference I've ever been to, it is the walking in between the sessions and the conversations that I had with people that were completely serendipitous, that often have had the biggest impact and absolutely informed my research and my practice. And it absolutely appalls me, the idea, recently in this country, we've seen this idea that it's great if children walk in silence around the school. If you've done that, what you're actually saying to them is back to that brain body. They are not detached from their bodies, and they need to actually experience life in an embodied way. And that means making noise and often smells and all the rest of it, and touch. And it's been very difficult. I've got a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old who have gone to school, and you don't touch people, you keep away from them. It just seems to me a terrible movement to kind of take that away from them even more. So, but children are a colonized group, but they are very subversive. And as an extra nursery teacher, I can tell you, they will often be very creative in the way they subvert.
I think it requires confident teachers,
absolutely,
to be able to understand the children that they're working with, to be able to relax away from those very specific expectations.
And I suppose it's also dehumanizing of teachers, because I think if you relax and you know your children and you're happy to share who you are with your children and they are happy to share who they are, then you like each other. And it is not about control as a kind of top down. It's a let's work together in a way that actually makes us all happy.
We should have teachers laughing with children.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why would you not?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I know you're having a conversation. We've got one more question that's just come through on the Slido. It's from Mavis again, Mavis Brew. What are the emotional implications to children, considering the diverse backgrounds? Oh, have I asked that one already? Deb, is that a new question? I think my app is frozen. There was another question. Can you see it? Sorry.
No, I can't see another question, but I have a question. So what are the challenges in your methodology as historians or history educators?
Who wants to go?
Silence. I love how that question can kill it all.
Well, my issue at the moment is the fact that I'm trying to contextualize an archive using an online approach. So that means, you know, I'm limited. I can show images and I can video, but touch that, you know, Karen talked so beautifully about earlier is kind of much more difficult. And it made me thinking, you know, what I would like to do is actually create packs that I could take to schools who wanted to take part in it, because I really would like them. I'd like children to be able to respond to the archive in multimodal ways. The other research I'm involved in at the moment, the Pay Observatory, that we're trying to capture children's experiences of the pandemic today. And we're doing again online because of COVID, but we really want children to be able to do things in multimodal ways. And so as well as uploading videos, they can send stuff to us at the University of Sheffield and we will, you know, archive it. So yeah, that's the thing I'm kind of struggling with. I'm trying to create the senses and emotion, but through a screen with all of that, you know, baggage.
We do. So I've just seen in the Meta's kindly put the question in the chat that I couldn't find on the app, which is how do we involve parents or caregivers in ways that bridge the gap between school and home context? And I assume that's particularly in the in the current time with COVID and all the challenges that represents.
That's right.
Oh, and linked to that, because we've only got a few minutes left.
Yeah.
Might it be possible to do something with augmented reality?
Well, that's some research I'm actually involved in as well, augmented reality and virtual reality.
That's Becky. Is that Becky?
Yes, that's with Becky, yes, with Becky and Jess, which is fabulous. Yeah. And that's, you know, nothing to do with the Opie stuff, but obviously I've been involved in it for a year and go, oh, oh, this looks really interesting. Because that's always been my dream, that I can create and I can, you know, walk the streets of, you know, wherever and really be immersed in it. So yeah, definitely. Oh yes.
Yeah, we've used we've worked with students and schools using augmented reality at gaming. So taking historical characters, explorers, for example, the students take on the personas of the explorers and then send messages to the children at the school, and the children are sending their questions back, and then they will eventually have a day together as well. And the parents and carers to bridge the gap between home and school contexts. I think communication, speaking to the parents and caregivers about what we're doing so that we can send the children home to talk to the parents, to bring things in from home, to have a show and tell at the end of the year, to have parents coming in to see what's going on. If you're not doing that, you should be, because there's such a wealth of experience out there, and you want to be linking, if you're linking to family, if you're linking to experiences in the past, you want them to be actually engaging in some oral history, talking to family members, bringing in those objects and photographs, and if you're not doing that, you're missing out on such a rich resource. So more for you if you're not doing it. You should be. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I think that is probably, we've only got 4 minutes left anyway, so I can't see any more questions.
Yep.
So yeah, I think we'd just like to say thank you, huge thank you to everyone, to all three speakers, and for sort of putting up with you know, as smooth and as impressive as the online format is. It, as Yinka said, it's not the same as seeing people face to face, particularly people that I've not seen for some time, and it would be really nice to meet up with. But yeah, thank you so much for your contributions. I think the papers really spoke to each other really, you know, well, and I think there was lots of interesting discussion, which it would have been lovely to carry on, you know, sitting outside somewhere nice and warm, but we can't do that, unfortunately. Hopefully we can again soon. So yeah, just like to say thank you again, and I think we're going to stay on, and thank you to the delegates as well, who I've not been able to see, but thank you so much for your questions, and for taking part in the polls, and just for showing up and being interested. Debbie, do you want to say anything?
Very much to echo what you have just said, to thank all of the presenters here today for their incredible papers and for the conversations that we've had, to thank all of those people out there somewhere who are watching this, who we cannot see, but your participation has been incredible as well. For those people who might be attending the BERA conference, we have a lovely suite of papers for that conference. And I know people would value your attendance and your input. So with that, have a lovely Friday.